The boundary markers had been out there for 60 years. 60 years of sitting in deep space, steady and silent, doing exactly one job. Telling anyone who came close enough to read them that this was where open space ended and Earth's territory began. Not aggressively. Not with weapons pointed outward or with any kind of threat built into the design. Just a clear, simple, unmistakable line drawn in the dark. A line that said, "You are welcome here, but ask first." Every civilization in the known galaxy understood what they meant. The markers broadcast in 43 languages on a continuous loop. They had been updated twice over the decades as new civilizations made contact and new languages were added to the rotation. The message in every single one of them was the same. This is Earth's boundary. Transmit your identification and your purpose. Wait for a response. Do not cross without clearance. In 60 years nobody had crossed without clearance. Until today. Commander Tom Reed had been at Earth Defense Command for 11 years. He had worked his way up through night shifts and double rotations and the kind of slow grinding patience that the job required more than anything else. Most days nothing happened. That was the point. The boundary held, the markers broadcast, civilizations sent their identification codes, clearance was granted or a conversation was started, and the machinery of peaceful contact kept turning without drama. Tom's job, most days, was to make sure the machinery kept running. He was on his second coffee of the morning when the alert came through. Not an alarm exactly. Earth Defense Command didn't use alarms for detection. Alarms made people react before they thought, and reacting before thinking was how situations became incidents. It was a tone. Low, steady, 3 pulses. The kind of sound that said, "Pay attention to this." Tom set his coffee down and looked at his monitor. 40 contacts. Moving in formation. Coming in from the outer edge of the Krull Federation's nearest controlled system, which put them about 6 hours from the boundary at their current speed. Tom pulled up the identification records without hurrying. 40 ships was a large formation but not unprecedented. Trade convoys ran that size sometimes. Military escorts for diplomatic missions occasionally ran larger. He checked the identification broadcast from the formation. Nothing. No code. No transmission. Not even an acknowledgement that the boundary markers existed. Tom flagged it and sent a standard contact request. Identification and purpose, please respond. He sent it in Krull first, then in the 4 other languages their diplomatic records listed as in use across their federation. Then he sent it in English because he always did, on principle. No response. He checked the formation speed. They hadn't slowed. Tom leaned forward slightly and pulled up everything on file about the Krull Federation. They were not a new contact. Earth had been in diplomatic communication with them for 22 years. They had trade agreements. They had an ambassador. They had sat across tables from human diplomats on 14 separate occasions and shaken hands, or the Krull equivalent, which involved pressing 2 fingers to the opposite wrist, and signed documents and smiled for whatever passed as photographs in their culture. There was absolutely no version of this that was accidental. 40 warships in formation did not accidentally forget to transmit their identification. Tom sent the contact request again. All languages. He added a note this time. Your formation is approaching Earth's boundary. Please respond immediately. Nothing. He looked at the clock. 4 hours and 50 minutes to the boundary at their current speed. He flagged the situation up the chain and got on with the next part of his job, which was documenting everything that was happening in real time with the kind of detail that people reading it later would find useful. Tom was very good at documentation. His reports were clear and precise and contained exactly what was needed and nothing that wasn't. The next 2 hours were quiet in the way that certain kinds of quiet are louder than noise. Tom sent the contact request 6 more times. He tried every frequency on record for Krull vessels. He sent a direct transmission to the Krull ambassador's office on their home station, flagged urgent, asking if there was something he needed to know about this formation. The ambassador's office sent back a reply that arrived 40 minutes later and said, in very careful diplomatic language, that they were not aware of any authorized Krull military operation in this region of space. Tom read that twice, filed it, looked at his monitor. The formation was 2 hours out now. Still the same speed. Still the same silence. General Pat Ward came into the room at the 1-hour mark. Didn't say anything. Pulled up the second monitor and looked at what Tom was looking at. They stood there together for a moment the way people do when they're both reading the same thing and arriving at the same conclusion. They're not going to stop, Pat said. No, Tom said. Doesn't look like it. Pat looked at the formation on the screen. 40 contacts. Steady. Deliberate. The kind of movement that had a decision behind it made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had decided to do it anyway. "Send the final warning," Pat said. Tom had it ready. Had written it an hour ago. He sent it now. One transmission, every available frequency, every language in the system, addressed directly to the commanding vessel of the crawl formation. Clear and plain and final. You are approaching Earth's boundary without clearance. This is your last communication before you cross. Turn your formation around or stake your purpose immediately. There will be no further warnings after this transmission. He sent it. Watched the signal travel. Watched the formation. Nothing changed. No response. No slowdown. 40 warships crossing the last stretch of open space before the boundary like the transmission had never happened. Like 60 years of a clearly marked line in the dark meant nothing at all. Tom watched the formation cross the boundary on his monitor. All 40 contacts, one after another, steady as anything, moving into Earth's territory without a single word. He leaned back in his chair. Picked up his coffee. "All right then," he said. The patrol grid covered every inch of Earth's boundary region. It had taken 20 years to build it to the coverage level it was at now. Hundreds of sensor stations, relay buoys, deep-range scanners that could pick up a single vessel at distances that made most other civilizations' detection systems look like they were working with telescopes and good intentions. Tom had always thought of it less like a security system and more like a nervous system. Millions of small signals constantly feeding back to the same central point, building a picture of everything happening in Earth's territory in real time. Right now that nervous system was telling him something that didn't make sense. He had been tracking the crawl formation since they crossed the boundary. 40 contacts, moving in tight formation, pushing deeper into Earth's territory at the same steady speed they had maintained since they left crawl space. Tom had watched them on his monitor the way you watched a situation you couldn't do anything about yet, calmly, carefully, making sure everything was documented. Then, 6 hours and 14 minutes after the boundary crossing, the contacts started dropping. Not all at once. One at a time, over about a 90-second window. 40 signals on his screen, each one steady and clear, and then one simply wasn't there anymore. Then another. Then 3 at once. Then the rest in quick succession until the last contact winked out and Tom was looking at a completely empty grid where 40 warships had been less than 2 minutes ago. He stared at the screen. He ran a diagnostic on the scanner network. Everything came back green. The grid was working perfectly. There was simply nothing there to detect. No debris field. No explosion signature. No residual heat bloom, no electromagnetic pulse, no distress beacon, no emergency transmission. When a ship was destroyed in space it left evidence, always. Physics didn't make exceptions. But there was nothing out there. Not a piece of hull plating. Not a power cell. Not a single fragment of anything that said 40 warships had ever existed in that space. Tom sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up his radio. "General Ward. You need to see the grid." Pat Ward looked at the empty screen for a long time without speaking. Tom had learned over 11 years that the length of Pat's silences was directly related to how significant something was. This was the longest silence he had ever personally witnessed from the man. "Run it again," Pat said finally. Tom ran every diagnostic available. Grid performance, sensor calibration, relay integrity, central processing. Everything came back the same. The system was functioning perfectly. The grid was clear. "They're gone," Tom said. Pat looked at the screen a moment longer. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when he had processed something and moved on to the next part. "Lock the documentation. Nothing leaves this building without my clearance." "Already done," Tom said. Pat looked at him. "Good." The Galactic Council found out 40 minutes later. Tom didn't know exactly how. The patrol grid data was locked and Earth's external communications had been on restricted broadcast since the boundary crossing. But information had a way of moving in the galaxy that didn't always follow the routes you tried to contain it to. Someone on one of the outer relay stations had picked up the formation going dark on their own long-range equipment. Someone else had noticed the crawl fleet stop transmitting. However it happened, by the time the first incoming transmission arrived at Earth Defense Command the Council channels were already running hot. The first call was from the Vareth Assembly's defense office. Tom picked it up, identified himself, confirmed that yes, a crawl formation had crossed Earth's boundary, confirmed that the formation was no longer showing on Earth's patrol grid, and when asked directly what had happened to the fleet, said that the situation was still being assessed. The second call came in while the first one was still going. Then a third. Tom ended up with 4 transmissions running simultaneously inside of 20 minutes. which was a logistical situation he handled by putting them all on a brief hold and drafting a standard acknowledgement that said Earth was aware of the situation was being assessed, and a formal communication would follow through the appropriate diplomatic channels. He sent that to all 12 and went back to watching the empty grid. The calls kept coming. By the end of the first hour, Tom had received 31 incoming transmissions from 11 different civilizations. They ranged in tone from carefully formal to barely contained panic, but underneath all of them was the same thing, the same question wearing different clothes. What happened out there? What did you do? What are you capable of that we didn't know about? Tom answered every single one with the same even, unhurried voice. Confirmed the facts. Declined to speculate. Referred them to the diplomatic channel. Thanked them for their communication. Pat stood at the back of the room and watched him work and didn't interfere. At one point, a very senior Galactic Council official, third tier, which was as high as it went before you were talking to heads of state, came through on a priority channel and asked Tom point blank whether Earth had deployed a weapon against the Krall fleet. Tom paused for exactly 1 second. Earth responded to an unauthorized boundary crossing, he said. We are currently assessing the situation. A formal communication will follow through the appropriate channels. The official pushed back. Tom repeated himself, word for word, same tone, same pace. The official eventually disconnected. Tom set the radio down and looked at his monitor. The grid was still empty. Still clean. 40 contacts gone without a trace, and the most powerful communications network in the known galaxy lighting up like a board trying to get answers from one building on one planet that had decided, very calmly and very deliberately, that it would talk when it was ready. Pat walked up beside him. Looked at the empty grid. Then at the 32 logged incoming transmissions sitting in the queue. 32 calls, Pat said. 33 now, Tom said, watching a new one come in. Pat almost smiled. Almost. You want a coffee? Tom looked at his empty cup. Yeah, he said. I really do. Beth Lawson had been a diplomat for 23 years. She had sat across tables from species that communicated through color changes in their skin. She had negotiated trade agreements in rooms where the atmosphere had to be artificially balanced to keep 3 different kinds of biology alive at the same time. She had once talked a minor border dispute down from the edge of an armed conflict over the course of 11 hours using nothing but patience, very careful word choices, and a shared understanding that nobody in that room actually wanted to explain a war to their people back home. She was not easily impressed by difficult rooms. But 12 ambassadors in the same space within 48 hours was, even by her standards, a lot. They had started arriving the morning after the grid went dark. Some came through official diplomatic request, which Beth processed the normal way: confirmation, scheduling, preparation of the appropriate briefing materials. Others showed up with considerably less notice, which told her everything she needed to know about how their governments back home were handling the situation. When ambassadors stopped following protocol, it wasn't because they had forgotten it. It was because someone above them was pushing hard enough that the usual steps felt like they were taking too long. Beth processed all of them the same way regardless. Calmly. Professionally. With the specific kind of unhurried efficiency that told people their urgency had been noted and would not be rewarded with shortcuts. She had the room set up simply. A long table, good lighting, nothing on the walls that could be read as symbolic of anything. Water on the table because hydration translated across most biologies even when nothing else did. 12 seats on one side. 3 on hers, herself, and 2 junior staff whose job was documentation and nothing else. They filed in over the course of 20 minutes and settled into their seats with the careful arrangement of people who were all thinking the same thing but hadn't decided yet how directly to say it. Beth watched them get comfortable and read the room the way she always did, not individual faces but the overall temperature. The collective weight of what was sitting unspoken. It was heavy. She had expected nerves. What she was reading was deeper than nerves. These were people who represented civilizations that had spent decades building their understanding of the galaxy's power structure. Who sat where, who deferred to whom, which lines were solid and which ones were negotiable. That understanding had absorbed a significant shock in the last 48 hours, and none of them had had enough time to rebuild it into something they felt steady on yet. Beth let them settle. Poured her own water. Set her folder on the table and left it closed. Thank you all for coming, she said. I know the timeline was short. The Varith ambassador spoke first, which Beth had expected. The Varith were always first. It was a cultural thing. Silence at the opening of a formal meeting was considered a sign of unpreparedness, and the Varith were never unprepared. His name was long, and Beth had long since learned to use just the first syllable in conversation, which he had confirmed was acceptable. Ambassador Lawson, he said. We would like to understand what happened in the boundary region 3 days ago. Of course, Beth said. I'll tell you what I can confirm. A Kral Federation fleet of 40 warships crossed Earth's outer boundary without identification or clearance. They did not respond to 17 separate contact attempts over a period of 6 hours prior to crossing. After crossing, they continued into Earth's territory. Approximately 6 hours after the boundary crossing, the formation ceased to appear on Earth's patrol grid. She said all of this in the same tone she might use to describe a weather pattern. Factual. Unhurried. No dramatic weight added anywhere. The room was quiet for a moment. Ceased to appear, said the ambassador from the Daven Collective, leaning forward slightly. You mean they were destroyed? I mean they ceased to appear on the patrol grid, Beth said. That is not an answer. It's the accurate one, Beth said pleasantly. The temperature in the room shifted. Not toward anger exactly. Toward something more like the feeling of a floor that had seemed solid a moment ago and was now being tested more carefully with each step. The Sorvari representative, a woman named Vel who had been in diplomatic service longer than Beth and had the kind of stillness that came from seeing most things at least once, spoke in a measured voice. What we are trying to understand, Ambassador Lawson, is what Earth is capable of. What you have perhaps been building quietly for some time without the Council's knowledge. Beth looked at her. The Galactic Council has no jurisdiction over Earth's internal development programs. No, Vel agreed. But it does have an interest in understanding what its members are capable of. For the purpose of collective stability. I understand that, Beth said. And I want to be clear that Earth takes its Council responsibilities seriously. She paused just long enough. We also take our sovereignty seriously. Including our right to respond to unauthorized military incursions into our territory. By making 40 warships disappear without a trace, someone said from the far end of the table. Beth looked calmly in that direction. By responding appropriately. The phrase landed in the room and stayed there. Beth had chosen it carefully, the way she chose all her words carefully. Not because it said a lot. Because it said exactly enough. It confirmed that Earth had done something. It declined to specify what. And the word appropriately did a very particular kind of work. It implied a scale of response, a range, a suggestion that what had been used here was measured. That there was more on the shelf. Nobody pushed her directly after that. They asked more questions. Beth answered the ones she chose to answer and redirected the ones she didn't with the smooth ease of someone who had been doing exactly this for over 2 decades. She confirmed facts. She declined to speculate. She expressed Earth's continued commitment to peaceful relations with all Council members. She said the word appropriately one more time when the moment called for it. By the end of the meeting, the room was quieter than it had started. Not satisfied, but quieter. The kind of quiet that meant people were thinking instead of reacting, which was exactly where Beth needed them. She walked them out personally. Shook hands, pressed fingers to wrists, touched foreheads, whatever each culture required. Professional and warm and completely unreadable. When the last ambassador left and the door closed, Beth walked back to the table, picked up her folder and looked at her junior staff. Good meeting, she said. They both stared at her. She picked up her water and finished it. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be busier. The project didn't have a dramatic name. That was intentional. The people who built it had learned early on that dramatic names attracted attention, and attention was the one thing this project could never afford. So they called it what it was in the most boring language they could find. Boundary Infrastructure Program. 3 words that sounded like a maintenance schedule. 3 words that made anyone who heard them think of sensor buoys and relay stations and the kind of administrative work that nobody wanted to read about. That was exactly the point. Pat Ward had been read into the program on a Tuesday morning 31 years ago. He had been a junior officer then, newly assigned to Earth Defense Command, still learning which coffee machine on which floor produced something actually worth drinking. His commanding officer at the time, a woman named General Carol Briggs who had retired 12 years ago and never once spoken publicly about anything she had worked on, had sat him down in a room with no windows and a door that locked from the inside and told him what Earth had been quietly building for the past 3 years. Pat had listened without interrupting. That was something Carol had specifically selected him for. His ability to hear large things without reacting to them immediately. To sit with information and let it settle before he decided what to think about it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How does it work?" Carol had almost smiled. "That's the right question," she said. The science behind it had started as a theoretical paper. Written by a physicist named Dr. Ron Ellis at a university in New Mexico who had been trying to solve a completely different problem entirely and had stumbled sideways into something that, when he followed it far enough, stopped looking like theory and started looking like engineering. The core idea was gravitational anchoring. Not gravity as a weapon, not pulling things apart or crushing them. Something far more subtle than that. The idea that you could create a field, layered and interlocking, that interacted with the fundamental systems of any vessel passing through it. Power generation, navigation, propulsion. Not by damaging them. By talking to them in a sense. By introducing a frequency into the field that every known propulsion system resonated with on a deep mechanical level and then simply holding that frequency still. Like stopping a pendulum by matching its swing exactly and then not letting go. The vessel didn't break. Nothing burned out. Nothing exploded. Everything just stopped. Every system simultaneously, cleanly, completely. The ship sat exactly where it was when the field caught it, intact in every way, crew alive and unharmed, and stayed there until the field was released. The clearance code worked as an interference pattern. A ship broadcasting the correct human-issued code created a frequency that the field recognized and moved around. Like water parting around a stone. Everything else got caught. Ron Ellis had written the original paper in a notebook he kept in his desk drawer because he didn't think anyone would take it seriously enough to publish. Carol Briggs had found it through a junior researcher who had found it through a contact who had found it through a conversation at a conference that had nothing to do with defense at all. That was how the most significant military development in human history started. With a notebook in a desk drawer in New Mexico. Building it had taken the better part of 3 decades. Not because the science was slow. Once they had the theory, the engineering moved faster than anyone expected. It took time because of the scale. The buffer zone wasn't a single installation. It was hundreds of anchor points distributed across a carefully calculated region of space surrounding Earth's boundary, each one tuned to the others, the whole network functioning as one interconnected system. Miss one anchor point and there were gaps. Gaps meant the field had holes. Holes meant the field didn't work. They had to build every single one. Position every single one. Calibrate the entire network as a unified system. And do all of it quietly over 30 years, with the maintenance vessels and supply runs disguised as the kind of routine boundary infrastructure work that the project's very boring name had always been designed to suggest. Pat had overseen the final phase of calibration himself. Stood in the monitoring room and watched the network come fully online for the first time and felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Not pride exactly. Something steadier than pride. The feeling of a long quiet thing finally being complete. They had tested it twice. Both times on unmanned vessels sent through without clearance codes. Both times the results were exactly what the theory predicted. The vessels stopped. Everything locked. The field held. When the field was released, the vessels drifted free, every system restarting cleanly once the frequency interference was gone. 40 warships was a larger scale than any test they had run. But the physics didn't care about scale. Pat stood in the monitoring room and looked at the empty patrol grid and thought about 40 crawl warships sitting out there in the dark right now. Completely intact. Every system locked and silent. Every crew member alive, confused almost certainly, probably frightened, sitting in the dark in ships that wouldn't respond to anything they tried. Waiting. Just waiting for a human hand to release the field and let them go. He thought about the 31 years it had taken to get here. The quiet work. The boring name. The notebook in a desk drawer in New Mexico. The hundreds of people who had built something enormous and said nothing about it to anyone outside that locked room because they understood instinctively what it was for. Not for starting something. For making sure nothing got started in the first place. Tom walked up beside him with 2 coffees. Set one down on the console without being asked. Looked at the empty grid the same way Pat was looking at it. How long do we hold them? Tom asked. Pat picked up the coffee. Thought about it for a moment. Long enough, he said. Pat gave the release order on a Thursday morning. No ceremony around it. No announcement beforehand. He walked into the monitoring room at 0700 with his coffee, looked at Tom who was already at his station already on his second cup, and said, "Release the field. All sectors." Tom typed the command sequence. 12 keystrokes. The same sequence they had tested twice before on unmanned vessels in controlled conditions. He hit the final key and looked at the grid. For about 4 seconds nothing changed. Then the contacts came back. All 40 of them. Appearing on the grid one after another in the same tight formation they had been holding when the field caught them 72 hours ago. Exactly where they had been. Exactly as they were. Every signal clean and steady, every vessel intact, the formation sitting in Earth's territory in the dark exactly as it had been left. Then, slowly the formation began to move. Not deeper in. Not toward Earth. Back the way they came. Turning in the careful coordinated way that large military formations moved when every pilot was making the same decision at the same time without needing to be told. The Kral fleet had woken up in the dark, found their systems responding again, and apparently reached a very quick collective conclusion about what direction they wanted to be traveling. Tom watched the 40 contacts move toward the boundary on his monitor. Steady. Unhurried. Nobody chasing them. Nobody broadcasting anything in their direction. Just 40 ships and a very long quiet journey back to where they came from. He finished his coffee. There they go, he said. Pat watched the grid without answering. He stayed there until the last contact crossed back over the boundary line and disappeared from Earth's patrol range. Then he set his cup down, picked up his folder, and went to his next meeting. Beth's diplomatic report was 4 sentences long. Her junior staff had expected something more substantial. They had prepared a full briefing template, cross-referenced with the 12 ambassador meeting notes, flagged the key points from each transmission received over the past 72 hours, built a proper framework for a thorough formal response. Beth looked at the template, looked at her staff, then opened a blank document and typed 4 sentences, printed it, signed it, and filed it. The sentences confirmed that a Kral Federation fleet had crossed Earth's boundary without clearance. That Earth had responded within its sovereign rights. That the fleet had been released unharmed after 72 hours. That Earth considered the matter resolved and looked forward to continued constructive relations with all Galactic Council members. That was it. Nothing more. No explanation of what had been used. No description of the buffer zone. No technical language of any kind. 4 clean sentences that said everything that needed saying and left everything else exactly where Beth had decided it belonged. Unspoken, sitting in the space between the lines where anyone reading carefully enough would feel it without being able to point to it directly. She sent it to the Council's formal records office and went to lunch. The debate in the Galactic Council chambers ran for weeks. Beth heard about it secondhand through the usual channels, ambassadors talking to junior staff who talked to other junior staff, the slow trickle of information that moved through diplomatic networks the way water moved through stone. Slowly but inevitably. The debate had several threads running at the same time and they kept tangling together. The first was about what Earth had actually built. Nobody outside a very small number of humans knew the specifics and none of those humans were talking, which meant the Council was working entirely from what they could observe. 40 ships went in, 40 ships came out unharmed, nothing in between. The range of theories being discussed apparently covered significant ground, from highly sophisticated to things that Pat would have found flattering if he had heard them. The second thread was about how long Earth had been building it. This was the one that seemed to unsettle people most deeply. 30 years was a long time. 30 years of quiet work, of boring names, of maintenance vessels doing what looked like routine infrastructure runs. 30 years of a project that nobody outside Earth had known existed until the moment it became impossible to ignore. The Council wasn't just reacting to what Earth had demonstrated. They were recalculating backward, thinking about everything they thought they knew about humanity and asking themselves what else might have been happening quietly in the background for years without anyone noticing. The third thread, which ran underneath the other 2 and was spoken about less directly but felt more heavily, was the simplest one. Earth had held 40 warships for 72 hours and let them go. Every crew member alive. Not a weapon fired. Not a threat issued. No demands made. They had simply stopped the fleet, held it, and released it. And the message inside that sequence of events, the message that didn't need to be spoken because it was written in the facts themselves, was that Earth had chosen to let them go. That this had been a choice. That there had been another option available and Earth had looked at it and set it aside. That was the part nobody in the Council chambers could fully get comfortable with. Not the capability. The restraint. Tom found out about the note in the Council's private files 3 months later through a contact he trusted and didn't ask too many questions about. He read it twice. Then he walked down to Pat's office and stood in the doorway and read it out loud. Pat listened. Looked out his window at nothing in particular for a moment. Accurate, he said. Tom folded the paper. Thought you'd want to know. Appreciated, Pat said. Then, close the door on your way out. Tom did. He walked back down the corridor to his station, sat down and looked at the patrol grid. Clean and quiet and empty the way it was supposed to be. The boundary markers out there in the dark doing their one job. The buffer zone sitting silent and invisible around them, patient as anything, waiting for a reason to be needed that Tom genuinely hoped would never come. Nobody crossed the boundary again. Not that year. Not the year after. The markers kept broadcasting in 43 languages on a continuous loop the way they always had, patient and clear and simple. This is Earth's boundary. Transmit your identification and your purpose. Wait for a response. Do not cross without clearance. And for the first time in 60 years the universe listened.